with that said, our speaker today is familiar to us. He helped us manage our county convention. And Seth Morris is the North Carolina Democratic Party Voter Protection Director. And so he has his fingers into the ins and outs and ups and downs of voter protection and all the issues surrounding elections, etc. And of course, we have Katrelia and George on board with us for any questions which would come up or to be directed to our local board. So can you unmute Seth? Oh, one other thing, before you do that, a wonderful book that is just coming out by Gene Nickel. We've heard him speak here a number of times. He has documented specifically what he calls the indecent assembly. That's the name of the book. Gene Nickel, Indecent Assembly, documenting everything that our Republicans have done since 2011 to try to take us back to not just the 1950s, but probably the 1850s. So that's a good book to get on your list, or you can go online and hear his summary of it. So Seth, can you take it away?
Absolutely. And Kenneth, would you allow me to share my screen?
Yeah, you are now the host. Can you not share the screen?
Okay, so it's just going to end your screen sharing. Hope that's all right. All right, hey everybody, this is Seth Morris. I'm the Voter Protection Director at the North Carolina Democratic Party, and I'm also a Salisbury native, so it's really good to be back with all of you today. I see a lot of familiar faces and a lot of familiar names, and it's really nice to be with you. I wish I could be there in person, obviously, but it's good to be with you virtually this morning. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about the voter protection program here in North Carolina that's being run by the North Carolina Democratic Party. And so first, I'm going to provide a little bit of national context of why I'm in this role and why we're doing the work that we're doing to protect voters. I'll speak a little bit about the specifics of that in North Carolina. Of course, something that is top of mind for everyone is planning for our election in the midst of this pandemic. And so I'll speak about some of the specific issues related to that. And then some of the common voting problems that my shop deals with, and then specifics about our voter protection program, the program that we're building here at the party. And then I'll take your questions about our program or about voting rights or any other questions you may have for me. And I won't volunteer Katrelia and George, but if they're willing to answer questions, I'd be glad to hear from them as well. So, sort of opening broadly, there is a national effort by the Republican Party to engage in voter suppression in 2020. And a lot of that arises from some newfound freedom that they have related to a 30-year-old consent decree that was entered into in 1982. After the 1980 election, the Democratic Party sued, and I said someone wants to see my face. Let me cut on my camera. And if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat throughout the presentation. But in 1982, after the 1980 election, the Democratic Party sued the Republican Party nationally because of several of the voter intimidation tactics that were used by Republicans and Republican affiliates in that election. Most of those were around poll monitoring, which often meant that they would send off-duty law enforcement or other armed persons to stand outside of polling places, predominantly in Black communities. That was clearly with the purpose of intimidating voters from going out to vote. And so the Democratic Party sued. A judge helped them enter into a consent decree that prevented Republicans from engaging in that kind of behavior. But in 2018, a new judge was appointed to that seat. It was in a Connecticut federal court, and he discarded the consent decree. So the Republicans have a lot more freedom now than they have for the past 3 decades to engage in voter suppression nationally. And of course, they're going to use that newfound power, and they have made that clear. President Trump has appointed an attorney who was previously in his Justice Department to serve as his Director of Election Day Operations. This person is, by all accounts, a zealot about voter suppression. He is really a true believer about voter fraud, and has specifically made comments about targeting minority communities and immigrant communities. I also see Mayor Higgins is taking a picture of this slide. Kenneth, I hope you can make this slide presentation available to everyone after my talk. And so to combat this new Republican effort, and I didn't even have time to add this to my slide because I just saw it this morning, President Trump announced yesterday that they are doubling the amount of money they're spending on voter suppression. Initially, they were going to spend $10 million nationwide on voter suppression litigation in response to a lot of Democratic lawsuits. They're doubling that to $20 million. I just saw that. So this is something that is very serious and is something that's going to play out in battleground states across the country. But to combat that effort, that voter suppression effort, Democrats are making new investments, early investments in voter protection in key battleground states across the country, North Carolina being one of them. These investments are the reason that I'm speaking to you today. Typically, the party doesn't have a voter protection director until the late summer or fall of a presidential election year. This year, I have joined the staff. I joined in February. I've also been able to hire a deputy and an organizer, and we're building out the biggest voter protection program that we've ever seen here in our state. And I would be remiss to say that, or to forget, that Stacey Abrams, the majority leader from Georgia, who ran for governor in Georgia in 2018, has been a real leader on this front as well, both in fundraising and in organizing, and in creating sort of best practices for people in my role. So we're really grateful to Stacey Abrams and her group, Fair Fight, out of Georgia. And so we're already starting to see all of this play out, and the sort of first shot across the bow was in the Wisconsin primary just a few weeks ago, where the Republicans used their $20 million litigation fund to try to, and successfully, prevent the governor of Wisconsin from postponing their primary there and making it an all-male election. They forced people to go out and vote in the midst of the pandemic. We already know that people have gotten sick because they went out to vote. They're traceable COVID cases related to people going out and voting because they were forced to. Republicans tried to throw out tens of thousands of absentee ballots that just because of administrative burdens arrived late, or arrived on time and couldn't be counted in time because there were so many new absentee voters. So we're already seeing this, and we know that the Republicans are gonna, we already knew they were gonna fight us and try to suppress the vote, but they're gonna take advantage of the pandemic too, it appears. And of course, right here in North Carolina, there's always a North Carolina connection when Republicans are doing something bad. Senate Majority Leader Phil Berger has already indicated that he doesn't trust the governor and the governor's appointed Board of Elections to fairly administer an election with lots of mail ballots. This is, of course, partisan nonsense, but it's also part of an effort to start sowing the seeds of doubt so that they can falsely claim voter fraud or enact punitive voter suppression in the name of voter fraud, ostensibly in the fall. So it's all part of a calculated effort too. The reason that all of this matters is that we know that when we expand the electorate, and we know that when we build a broad coalition as a party, we win. When more people vote, Democrats win. I always lean on the fact that Mitt Romney got more votes than Donald Trump, but Barack Obama was reelected president. And that's because when Democrats go out and vote, Democrats win. And right here in North Carolina, Republicans have tried to make it harder for minorities, for the poor, for students, for the elderly to vote. They've done this with voter ID. They've done this with changes to the absentee ballot procedures. They've done this by trying to limit early voting. And then, of course, they've tried to take away political power from all those groups by extensively gerrymandering the state now several times. And so my shop, myself and my deputy and my organizer, we're working to combat all of this. We're working to combat misinformation, to stop voter intimidation, to provide information to voters and answer their questions, and then just troubleshoot problems as they arise. And of course, when things get really bad, we're willing to litigate matters about voting rights. And in fact, the party is involved in several lawsuits currently. And at the end of the day, what I think about, and when I think about all of the work that we're doing, is that voter suppression and matters of voter protection happen on the margins. Maybe it's only 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 10 people in a precinct that get turned away or get discouraged from voting because of onerous laws or a precinct judge who turns them away without having a full understanding of the law. But in 2016, Governor Cooper won by only 10,277 votes. So there are 2,700 precincts in North Carolina, which means that on average, Governor Cooper won by less than 4 votes per precinct in the state. And so if 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 10 Democratic voters are turned away or are discouraged from voting in every precinct in the state, that means that Republicans sweep elections here. This is an incredibly competitive state. It's a 50-50 state. And so every vote really matters, and making sure that every voter gets to cast their ballot is really important, not only morally and legally, but also because it helps Democrats win. So I want to speak specifically for a minute, because I know it's on the top of everyone's minds, about the election in the face of COVID-19. And having an election in the midst of a pandemic creates innumerable issues, but these are sort of the big 3, to my mind, that I think will be problems in the fall. The first, and this is overarching and there are numerous related issues, is that the county boards of elections, and I'm sure that our board members who are on this call would agree with me, are going to be really strained because of this. In many counties, boards of elections have been asked to cut their budgets because local governments are taking in fewer tax receipts. And that comes at a time when, because of increased vote by mail and the need to spread out voting sites and increase curbside voting, they need more staff and they need more equipment at all of these county boards of elections. And then compounding that is that we've already seen in the other states that had primaries later than us, poll workers who are often in the most vulnerable group for COVID-19. Most poll workers are folks who are retired and older, are not feeling comfortable working at their polling place that they may have worked at for 10 or 20 years. And so county boards of elections are having to find new people and train new people to be judges and poll workers. So all of that is just an enormous strain on the county boards. This is a part of that strain, but it's its own separate issue. We expect a huge increase in vote by mail, and in fact, we want to help people vote by mail if they feel most comfortable doing that. Typically in North Carolina, only about 3 to 5% of the electorate votes by mail in any given election. North Carolina is in a strange class of states where anyone can vote by mail. We have no excuse to vote by mail, but it's not something that a lot of people take advantage of historically, because we have had good early voting opportunities, primarily is the cause. But this year we expect anywhere between, and this is a number coming from the Board of Election, the State Board of Elections, anywhere between 30 and 50% of voters to take advantage of voting by mail. So we're talking about an order of magnitude more. So that will strain county boards of elections who have to process those requests and those ballots, but it's also going to be a difficult thing for our voters because voting by mail is a little bit complicated. You have to send in a request form first. Then you have to vote your ballot and get either 2 witnesses or a notary public to acknowledge that your identity and that you cast that ballot. And then you have to provide postage for both of those things. So it's a little bit difficult for folks, and we want to make sure that people know how to do it right if they take advantage of vote by mail. So that will take a significant organizing and education effort. It's something that the party and the coordinated field program is orienting towards right now. We have hired a lot of field organizers. They're going to be spread out all across the state, and their job is going to look a little bit different this year because it's going to include substantially more work around vote by mail. And then we, of course, anticipate that running voting sites will be more difficult, and that because of sanitization and social distancing, the incremental amount of time that it takes each voter to vote may be 30 seconds more, or a minute more, or a minute and a half more. And in busy polling sites and at peak hours, that incremental increase of time for each voter is going to add up and create backlogs. So we expect long lines associated with changes at the polling place. And then, of course, there's going to be an increased demand for curbside voting because many voters are, on account of their vulnerability to the virus, not going to want to go into the polling place and are going to want to curbside vote. And so we're working around that all with the State Board of Elections and trying to figure out best practices to make sure that polling site voting runs smoothly. So before COVID-19, there were already a lot of issues that people face when they go voting. And I sort of break them down into 2 buckets. The first is common voting issues before polling places open, and then common voting issues that actually occur once people begin to vote. Something that is first on the calendar for me is early voting plans. And in many counties, and I know Rowan is lucky not to be one of them, boards of elections, because of budget strains, but also just maybe because of tradition, don't have adequate early voting sites, don't have enough sites, don't have weekend hours, things like that. And I know that Rowan County is working towards having a more expansive early voting plan this year, and really grateful for that, because having those opportunities on the weekends and in sort of non-9 to 5 hours, and having enough sites spread out across the county is going to be really important as we think about social distancing and making sure that there aren't too many people in any given polling place at any given time. Then there is this issue of having precinct judges and poll workers who have decided not to participate this year. There is an effort at the state level to increase the pay for poll workers and to provide some marketing and recruitment funds to the county boards. We've been supportive of that effort with our Democratic legislators, but that's going to be something that's really important and for the counties to acknowledge, of course, and that starts right now. Then there will be this inevitable backlog of mail-in ballot requests and mail-in ballot returns, just because each of those has to be processed by hand and has to be dealt with by a real person. And those just take a lot of time. It takes a lot of time to review those forms, to input information, to mail out the ballot, and then once the ballot returns, to review the application and count those ballots. And so we expect a backlog there. And it's just something that, another thing that counties need to be thinking about and preparing for. And then the sort of traditional voter intimidation, misinformation, and voter suppression is something that we anticipate seeing before people start voting. So that's things like pamphlets or mail or robocalls with misleading information about voting or trying to intimidate certain communities from voting. The sort of classic example that by my account comes up in nearly every election is targeting African American men specifically, and it is usually something about either child support. You know, if you go and vote and you owe child support, then you will be arrested, or targeting people that have any sort of criminal conviction, and saying, you know, if you have a criminal record, then you can't vote and we can arrest you if you try to do that. Of course, former felons in North Carolina who are still on probation or are still owe fines and fees can't vote, but folks who have served their time, paid their fines and fees, can vote, and there's a lot of misinformation and intimidation about that, particularly in the Black community. And then another thing that we have seen in the past, and is sheriffs in particular threatening the immigrant communities, the Latino communities across the state, and trying to get lawful citizens who are registered to vote and are eligible to vote not to vote by threatening them and their families, you know, suggesting that people might be deported if a family member goes out and votes, which is, of course, an enormous problem. And then these are sort of the issues that are most typical on election day. Most of them are just administrative problems, but administrative problems can prevent people from voting, and so they're really important. And you know, this is just a function of having 2,700 precincts and being a really big state. Not every poll worker is going to be properly trained. Not every precinct is going to run as smoothly as it should. And you know, of course, these things all happen on the margins, but as I have said before, the margins really matter. And so most of these are administrative, you know, issues with curbside voting, not enough parking, broken machines, not enough ballots, et cetera. Or issues with training, judges or poll workers who just have a misunderstanding of the law and turn somebody away who is eligible to vote at that polling place. And then there's, you know, the classic voter intimidation at the polling place, the kinds of things that the Republicans were prevented from doing for the past 30 years that they're now, though we have some good state laws in place, they're now operating from out under that consent decree and have more freedom to engage in at polling places. And so that is the context of my work and the things that I think about on a daily basis. And we're building this program. Me as the director, I have a deputy, and then an organizer, and we're building this program that largely operates in 3 buckets. The first is advocacy. So that looks like communicating with the Board of Elections, the State Board of Elections, about issues that we see statewide that has increased because of COVID-19, and talking with our Democratic legislators about what kind of law changes we would like to see to make it easier to vote. And then the second part is education. That is things like this conversation, but it's also providing voting rights materials and specific trainings to Democrats and to community groups. And then what will become a more significant part of our program as we get closer to the election is our voter assistance hotline. And so this is a toll-free number that any voter can call, or anyone who's calling on behalf of a voter can call to ask questions about voting. This number will be blasted out on social media and in digital advertising and in mail and in any other way that we communicate with voters and try to get out the vote throughout the summer and the fall. And people can call and ask where their polling place is or what, check on their registration status. And then of course, ask questions if they're being turned away from the polls or see an issue at the polls. And we will have trained volunteers on that hotline at all times. In fact, it's already live right now. And one other thing I'll say about the hotline, it became incredibly important in Georgia in 2018 after the election, when they were in sort of a recount stance around the governor's race down there. The hotline became a tool for making sure that people who had voted provisionally could get their ballots counted. And so we'll be orienting towards that as well. And then the third part of our program is the organizing. And so that's recruiting poll observers to serve at polling places, both inside and outside, recruiting hotline volunteers to answer voters' calls and assist them to make sure that they can vote. And then recruiting attorneys for our statewide legal boiler room. And so we'll have a team of lawyers here in Raleigh on election day and in the days leading up to election day. And though my fingers are crossed, probably in the days after the election, if we have some close races, who will be dealing with the legal issues around voting and filing any lawsuits if we need to, or preparing for any recounts if we have those here. And so I want to speak specifically because this is sort of the core of our volunteer and organizing work about poll observers. Under the consent decree that the Republicans, that tied the Republicans' hands, their poll observers couldn't really engage as much as North Carolina law allows poll observers to do. But now that they are free from that consent decree, we expect the Republicans to deploy lots of poll observers, both inside and outside. And so we'd like to have Democrats in our Democratic precincts doing the same and making sure that everybody is operating between the lines of the law. So there are two buckets of poll observers. There are the outside poll observers, and those are folks who stand outside, have the hotline number. We're hoping to have that on signs and on T-shirts, et cetera, and are there just to make sure that voters have a pleasant experience voting. And this isn't necessarily folks who are handing out blue ballots or anything like that. In fact, it's often helpful if they appear as nonpartisan as they can. This is folks who are just there to make sure that every voter can vote and that make sure that they have a positive voting experience. So that's things like making sure that curbside voters are being recognized and being assisted in a timely manner, checking in with folks if there's a long line, and then if anyone gets turned away, making sure that those folks either get to vote at the precinct where they should, or if there's an issue and they should be voting at that precinct, to call our hotline to talk to one of our attorneys about what that person needs to do. And many of those issues can also be addressed with the County Board of Elections. And then there are the inside observers, and those are both precinct appointed observers and then the 10 at-large roaming observers. Those are folks who just sit in the precinct, develop a rapport with the judges, and judges can be a little standoffish with observers because they feel like we have somebody there to tell them how to do their job. But if an observer is friendly and they have our law guide, and if there are any questions and the judge doesn't know, our observer can politely communicate an answer if we have one. And of course, if there are problems with judges, if there's a precinct where there's some real issues, that observer can report that out, and we can try to address it either at the county board level or at the state board level. So the key takeaways before I open up for questions are that there is this large national effort, this $20 million effort by the Republicans to deploy observers, to fight in court, to do everything that they can to suppress Democratic votes nationwide. That's especially true in North Carolina because we are the battleground state in this election. No other state has as many potential opportunities for parties to change power than North Carolina this year. Not only are we competitive in the presidential race and in a U.S. Senate race, but also we have to re-elect Roy Cooper, all of our Council of State. We have several Supreme Court and Court of Appeals cases. And then, of course, all 170 of our legislators are up for re-election. So we have the chance to flip the balance of power in the legislature. And then we have several newly competitive congressional seats. So North Carolina is the battleground state, and Republicans are going to do everything they can to win here. Of course, the virus has changed everything. You already knew that, but it is going to have some acute effects on our electoral system, and we all just need to be thinking about how to address those now. And then, organizing now and communicating now are key to protecting voting rights. Making sure that you have poll observers, making sure that we have folks on our hotline, and that all of those people are in communication is really important. One of the more frustrating things in my job is when I hear about problems where voters were being turned away after the fact, and there's nothing I can do about it at that point. And so, having open lines of communication between me and our statewide team, but also, back to your county team, is really important to protect voters, both in Rowan County and across the state. And then, of course, all of this begins now. So this is a slide that I always have in here, and it says talk to your county board members. I recognize I'm talking to some of our county board members in Rowan County right now about what you all need and what an early voting plan looks like in Rowan County. And then be talking with voters in your community and see what information's out there, see what questions people have. Of course, I'm always happy to answer questions for anyone who has them. But you all can be leaders for your folks. So with that, I will take questions, and I have